Night falls differently over the Aegean. It does not descend like a curtain, but unfurls, soft and slow, like ink spilled across parchment, seeping gently into the folds of the sky. The waves hush their rhythm. The wind forgets its urgency. And somewhere between the hush of the sea and the sigh of the stars, the past begins to speak. You may not hear it at first, but listen. There's a whisper beneath the moonlight, a voice carried in fragments, stitched together by the breath of centuries, worn down by the wind that once touched the sails of myth. It doesn't shout. It never demands. It simply waits for someone like you, someone quiet enough to listen, patient enough to dream. The voice says a name, Ariadne. It slips through olive branches and dances along marble ruins, as though the stones themselves remember her. And they do, not clearly, not with precision, but in echoes, in symbols carved into half-forgotten temples, in the curve of a spiral etched into ancient pottery, in the haunting gaze of a goddess statue, now missing its eyes. They say history is written by victors, but myth is written by longing. And in the myth of Ariadne, something aches. Not loudly, not cruelly, but deeply, like the echo of a song once heard in a dream, just before waking. This is not a tale of monsters and heroes, not exactly. It is a tale of a girl who stood at the edge of two worlds. A girl born of kings, bound by rituals older than memory, who watched men turn themselves into legends while she remained a footnote. But perhaps she was the story all along. We begin not in a palace, but in the in-between. In the liminal space between dusk and night, where stars begin to blink awake and your thoughts begin to slow. In this moment, your body softens, your breath deepens, and Ariadne steps through the veil. She is not the girl from the textbook, not just the giver of thread. Tonight, she is more. She is the dream within the myth, the question inside the answer, the thread that connects not only a labyrinth, but the fabric of our own unspoken griefs and freedoms. Can you feel her? Perhaps not with your eyes, but with something older, some sense that hums just below awareness. The same sense that stirs when you stand before ruins and feel a presence that has no name. That is where Ariadne lives. Not in statues, not in scrolls, but in that whisper beneath the moonlight. That breath of something forgotten, waiting to be remembered. They say the past is gone, but those who walk slowly through twilight, who let the ancient wind graze their skin, know better. Some stories do not end. They sleep, and tonight, one awakens. Close your eyes. The sea is still. The sky has opened. Let us follow the thread. Before the story became story, there was an island. Not a name on a map, but a breath in the vast blue chest of the Aegean. Naxos. Its name will come later, carved in ink and memory. But in the beginning, it was only presence. Stone, wind, salt. An island that does not rush to be known. At first glance, it might appear like any other in the Cyclades. White cliffs rising from turquoise water, olive trees bending slightly to the west, and that eternal sun, slow and ancient, painting gold across every surface. But Naxos is different. It doesn't just exist in the sea, it watches it. And there, on a high ridge of crumbling limestone, you can almost feel it. That quiet awareness, that weightless gaze, as if the island has seen too much to speak and instead chooses to remember in silence. Some believe islands forget, but this one remembers. It remembers Ariadne, not just the goddess she would become, nor the myth she would inhabit, but the girl, barefoot, blinking against the light, caught in the winds between betrayal and rebirth. It was here that she awoke, alone. The sea below Naxos is not gentle. Its colors are too deep, too sharp. like thoughts you'd rather not have at night. When Theseus left, the tide did not weep for her. It simply went on being the sea, folding in and out upon itself like the breath of something unconcerned with human sorrow. But the island mourned. They say the stones along the eastern coast darken at dawn, as if still wet with her tears. They say the gulls cry louder here than anywhere else, though none can explain why. They say she screamed once, just once, and the wind never forgot the sound. But maybe she didn't scream. Maybe Ariadne, daughter of Crete, betrayed by both blood and lover, simply sat upon the jagged rocks, her hands wrapped around her knees, watching the sea as it swallowed the sail of the man she had saved. And in her silence, she made a choice. Not to chase him, not to curse him, but to become something else entirely. Some stories say Dionysus found her in her despair, that he rose from the sea or descended from the sky, drawn by the scent of abandonment. But others, those whispered by old women in small island kitchens, say Ariadne was not found. She called, not with her voice, but with her change, with the transformation that only pain can conjure. The moment when one no longer clings to identity, but dissolves into something freer, stranger, wilder. It began on Naxos, long before the crown of stars, before the wine-dark rituals, before the ecstatic dances and the forest breath. There was this island, and this silence, and this girl. Not broken, becoming. And the island watched, not as witness, but as midwife. It cradled her in its crags, let her walk its winding paths, let her sleep under fig trees and weep in the sand, let her rage into the hills, barefoot and forgotten, until the rage softened into knowing. It is said the soil of Naxos makes grapes sweeter than anywhere else. And perhaps that is why Dionysus came. Not for her despair, but for her ripening. Because the island did not break her. It aged her. It distilled her. When you walk on Naxos now, you will not see her. But if you close your eyes near the southern cliffs at dusk, you may feel the hush, that sacred pause in the air, as if something sacred once slept here, and maybe still does. The island that watched the sea, watched her become more than a myth. It watched her remember who she was before she was ever named. So now, you too may rest. Let the waves soften behind your breath. Let the wind trace your temples with its centuries-old hush. And feel beneath you not the mattress or the ground, but the memory of Naxos, patient and wild, waiting for you too to become. They say she held it delicately, as one might hold breath during a prayer. A thread, golden, fine, impossibly light. Not a rope, not a chain, but something between a lifeline and a promise. In the myths, this thread is her legacy. The one detail everyone remembers. Ariadne, the girl who gave Theseus the means to survive the labyrinth. But threads, like stories, are rarely what they seem. What if I told you the thread was not for Theseus at all? What if I told you it was hers? Always hers. Spun from something older than love, older than fear, older even than the Minotaur beneath the palace stones. Let us walk backward through time's breathless corridors into the heart of the labyrinth. Not the literal one, but the one beneath it. The one inside her. Ariadne was not just a princess. She was a priestess, raised not merely among marble columns and royal silks, but within the sacred rituals of Knossos. She learned the language of the moon and the meaning behind spirals. She danced in rites that predated the gods of Olympus, in circular rhythms that mirrored the womb of the world. And when she was old enough, she was entrusted with a thread, not a weapon, not a gift, but a path, a guide, a sacred symbol from the great mother cults, representing the descent into chaos and the journey back into light. The thread was wisdom, and she had earned it. So when Theseus came, a stranger cloaked in heroic arrogance and youthful certainty, it is tempting to imagine that she fell in love, that she was moved by his bravery, that she gave him the thread out of longing. But perhaps that is the myth men told themselves. Perhaps Ariadne looked at him and saw not a hero, but a test. Another soul lost in the spirals of his own shadow, brimming with fury, pride, and desperate hope. And so she gave him the thread, not because she loved him, but because she recognized his fear, because she knew what it meant to be trapped. The labyrinth was not only stone corridors and mythic monsters. It was patriarchy, silence, duty. It was the weight of a name given at birth. It was a girl born with power in a world afraid of her fire. And so she offered the thread, not to rescue him, but to rescue herself, to break the pattern, to prove that knowledge was stronger than the sword. It glowed faintly in her palm that night. Some say it shimmered like the path of a comet. Others say it pulsed gently, like a heartbeat outside the body. She wound it tightly, carefully, whispering words the myths do not record. Follow the thread, and you will not be lost. But he never asked where the thread came from, or why she carried it. He saw it as a tool, a ladder out of darkness. He did not see the centuries of wisdom behind it, the temple rites, the blood, the songs. He never knew it was meant to guide anyone who entered the labyrinth, including herself. Because Ariadne had always planned to leave. Not the palace, nor Crete, but the identity that confined her. She used the thread the way the ancients intended, to mark the center of the soul, to walk through fear without forgetting the way back, to unwind the self into its truest form. And as Theseus descended into darkness, sword in hand, she stood above, still as moonlight, the thread slipping through her fingers like the turning of time itself. She did not wait for him. She did not tremble. She watched the stars instead, and began to imagine a life beyond labyrinths and kings. A life where her hands held not thread for men, but thread for weaving her own becoming. So tonight, as you breathe slowly, softly, imagine a golden thread in your palm. Feel its warmth. It does not bind you. It frees you. You too can follow it into your own labyrinth, and beyond it, into the myth you were always meant to write. The thread is yours now, and the story has only just begun. Some structures breathe, not with lungs, but with memory. They inhale every footstep, every whispered secret, every tremble of fear that passes through their halls. And then, in the stillness of night, they exhale. Knossos was one of those places. Not merely a palace, not just the political heart of ancient Crete, but something older, stranger. A pulse beneath stone, a mind made of corridors, a god who had long ago forgotten he was worshipped. To the outside world, Knossos was magnificent. Painted columns of vermilion and black, rising like tree trunks in an orchard of marble. Frescoes danced across the walls. Lithe youths leaping over bulls, women with bare breasts and regal poise, griffins coiled in eternity. The air smelled of beeswax and crushed herbs, and the floors were smooth as sleep. But beneath the perfume and painted grace, there was the labyrinth. They called a maze, but it wasn't. Not in the way we think of mazes today. There were no dead ends, only endless turns, spirals, like the coils of a shell or the folds of the brain. It was a place built not to confuse the body, but to confuse the soul. And in the center, they said, was a beast, half man, half bull, the Minotaur, the child of shame and sacredness, Ariadne's half-brother. But let us be careful with such words, because myths are mirrors, and sometimes the beast in the center of the labyrinth is nothing more than the self, misunderstood. Was the Minotaur truly a punishment? A secret? A symbol? Perhaps he is all of these and none. Let's go deeper. Picture Ariadne, young but not naive, walking the outer halls of Knossos, her bare feet touching the same stones laid by hands that had long since turned to dust. She knows the rituals. She has seen the offerings left at thresholds. She has watched her mother, Pasiphae, wear silence like a second skin, her smile tight, her eyes far too still. And Ariadne hears it, the breath. The labyrinth does not roar. It murmurs, a low, steady sound like wind moving through bone, like something alive, dreaming, waiting. She is told never to go down there, but she does. One night, when the moon is high and the palace is hushed in wine-soaked slumber, she descends. Not out of rebellion, but out of recognition, because something in her aches in the same rhythm, because her dreams lead her there, because in the myths told by women, the ones men never write down, the labyrinth is not a prison, but a place of becoming. A rite, a descent not into danger, but into truth. She walks the spirals. Her fingers trail the damp walls. She hears her own heartbeat echo against the stone. It sounds like hoofbeats. And then she feels it, not the Minotaur, but herself splintering. The girl who must smile at feasts. The daughter of kings. The giver of thread. All falling away. She comes to understand that the monster was never meant to be slain. It was meant to be seen. Some even whisper that the Minotaur never existed. That it was a metaphor born from the clash between matriarchal mystery and patriarchal order. A creature invented to justify the maze's horror, to bury the feminine rites that once took place there. Rites of blood, of moon, of transformation. The archaeologists who later unearthed Knossos tried to name everything. They called a palace, labeled rooms as throne rooms, storerooms, shrines. But even they admitted it felt like something more. A sacred architecture, a temple of mystery disguised as a court. And the breath of the labyrinth, it still lingers. If you stand in certain chambers, deep below the tourist paths, you can feel a cool wind on your skin. But there are no windows, no open doors, just the stones exhaling. Perhaps it is the breath of the Minotaur, or perhaps it is Ariadne herself, still walking the path in memory, showing the way to those willing to feel, not just think. The labyrinth was not built to trap men. It was built to change them. And the thread? It was never for escape. It was the map of inner return. Tonight, as your thoughts spiral softly towards sleep, let them wander the corridors of Knossos. Let the breath of the labyrinth meet your own. Inhale, exhale. There is no Minotaur here. Only the quiet knowing that every twist, every turn is part of the path. And the thread, golden, gentle, will always lead you home. In the myths, they say he was a monster. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, a beast born of lust and punishment, kept hidden in the belly of the labyrinth, where even the sun refused to shine. He was the shame of a kingdom, the secret that breathed behind marble walls. They called him Asterios, though few remember that now. The stars were his namesake, but none looked up when they spoke of him. They looked down. But myths, as we've whispered before, are never what they seem. Let us begin not with the beast, but with the woman. Pasiphae, Ariadne's mother, a daughter of the sun god Helios, married to King Minos of Crete, a queen of power, wrapped in gold and silence. And she was cursed, so the story goes, because Minos defied Poseidon. The sea god had sent a bull from the depths, a creature of divine beauty and terror, as a sign of favor. Minos was to sacrifice it, but he did not. He kept it, coveted it, and Poseidon, insulted, turned his vengeance not toward the king, but toward the queen. Pasiphae once proud and luminous, was seized by a desire so unnatural, so violent in its mystery, that it split her soul from her sanity. She fell in love with the bull, and from that coupling, however it came to be, through magic, through madness, through myth, came the child, the Minotaur. But let us pause. Let us breathe. This story, retold through centuries by trembling poets and indignant priests, always stumbles here, always shrouds Pasiphae in shame, always paints the child as abomination. But perhaps we've been listening to the wrong voices. Because what is the bull, if not the oldest god? In ancient Minoan rites, the bull was not horror, it was holiness, a symbol of fertility, power, transformation. Young dancers leapt over bulls in sacred rituals, trusting the creature's grace more than the earth beneath them. The bull was life and death, flesh and divinity, horn mystery and moonlit fire. So what if Asterios was never meant to be cursed? What if he was born not a punishment, but prophecy? A child who straddled two worlds, animal and human, chaos and order, blood and spirit. A mirror of the labyrinth itself. And what of Ariadne? She grew up in the shadow of this myth. Her half-brother hidden beneath the palace. Whispers followed her through the halls, of madness, of gods, of sins carved into flesh. But she never called a monster. Some say she visited him, slipped past guards with bowls of pomegranate and fig, whispered lullabies through cracks in stone. Some say she placed her hand to the cold wall of the labyrinth and felt his breath rise on the other side. Heavy, wounded human, he was her brother, not by choice but by blood. And blood, in myth and in life, is a thread more binding than fate. They say he wept when he first saw Theseus, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He saw himself in the man with the sword. Not the face, but the eyes, the same terror, the same hunger to be more than the shape the world had forced upon them. But no one asked the Minotaur if he wanted to fight. No one asked if he understood why the world hated him. They only called him Beast, and they fed him children. History is cruel like that. It repeats the same lie until even the stones believe it. But Ariadne, she remembered. She remembered the tremble of the walls when Asterios howled at night. She remembered the loneliness that stained the floors like wine. She remembered the songs Pasiphae no longer sang, and the way her mother stared too long at the sea. So when Theseus arrived, with his polished armor and careless charm, and when he spoke of slaying the beast, Ariadne said nothing of her brother. She gave the thread. She gave the map, but deep inside, she gave a farewell, not to a monster, to a boy who had never known the sun. Perhaps that is why she could not stay, why she left the palace behind, because the real labyrinth was not beneath Knossos. It was the silence wrapped around every truth she had ever known, and to follow her own thread meant leaving the shadow of the bull behind, not in fear, in mourning. Tonight, as you lie in the stillness of your own shadows, know this: not every monster is a villain. Not every labyrinth needs escape, and not every thread leads away. Some threads lead through sorrow, through blood, through the part of you you've buried because others called it unlovable. Let that part breathe. Let be seen. The labyrinth sees you, and so does Ariadne. The thread is still in your hand, and the story continues. They call him a hero. Theseus, Prince of Athens, Slayer of Beasts, Breaker of Curses, the golden boy in every retelling, carved into marble, praised in song. A man who journeyed across the sea not for gold, but for glory. But heroism, like all things in myth, bends beneath the weight of shadow. And tonight, as the moon leans low and the stars blink like ancient witnesses, we turn that golden image toward the dim light of truth and find, perhaps, a mirror instead. When Theseus arrived in Crete, the air was thick with fear. Athens had wronged King Minos, and every 9 years, the city sent 7 boys and 7 girls as tribute, children whose names were never recorded, swallowed by the hunger of the labyrinth. And in their absence, Athens bought peace. Theseus volunteered, or so the stories claim, a prince offering himself for the people, fearless and noble. But behind the tale, another thread glimmers faintly. Some whisper he sought not justice, but fame. Others say he was driven by guilt, or by the desperate need to define himself outside the long shadow of his absent father, Poseidon. Whatever the truth, when he stepped onto the shores of Crete, the island saw him not as savior, but as stranger. Ariadne saw him differently still. He was tall, yes, strong, eyes full of fire, but it wasn't the fire that drew her. It was the flicker of something else beneath it, a fracture. He walked like a man who believed the world owed him a name. And names, Ariadne knew, were masks more than identities. She watched him from the colonnades of Knossos, watched how he stood too straight, how he smiled too easily. And yet, beneath that charm was a tremble. She had seen many men pass through those halls, warriors, priests, diplomats. But Theseus didn't look at the frescoes. He looked at the shadows between the torches. He didn't walk through the palace. He stalked it, as if searching for something already lost. And she understood. He wasn't there to slay a beast. He was there to slay a part of himself. The part that feared he was ordinary. The part that feared he would die nameless. The part that trembled in the dark and whispered, "You are not enough." When he spoke to Ariadne, it was not with the poetry of a lover. It was with the calculation of a man who saw her as the next step in a plan. She, the daughter of the king. She, the keeper of the labyrinth's secret. She, the key. But Ariadne, she listened. She didn't stop him. Didn't call out the way his voice cracked when he asked about the beast. Didn't flinch when his fingers grazed the hilt of his sword with too much need. Instead, she offered him a mirror. Not of glass. Of thread. The golden thread was not just a guide. It was an invitation to face the truth of who he was when no one else could see. To follow the spirals, not to the center of the labyrinth, but to the center of himself. Because Ariadne knew. The real Minotaur wasn't in the dark. He was in Theseus. In his rage. In his pride. In his thirst for stories that would echo beyond his bones. And she knew that when he returned, victorious, bloodied, breathless, he would look at her not with love, but with the dull panic of a man who had seen too much of himself. And so it was. Theseus killed the Minotaur, or what was left of the boy behind the myth. He emerged not as a man transformed, but as a man hollowed. And when he looked at Ariadne, he did not see her. He saw the part of him that had trembled in the dark, and he could not bear it. Love, real love, requires reflection. And Theseus could not look into her eyes without seeing the truth. That he was not a hero. He was a survivor. And survivors often leave behind what reminds them of their own weakness. So when the ship sailed from Naxos, he left her, not because she was unworthy, but because she had seen him, and he could not forgive her for it. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you too have known someone like that. Someone who saw your soul, and then fled, not because you weren't enough, but because you were too much, too clear, too honest, too real. Know this. That clarity is not a curse. It is your thread. It is your mirror. And as you close your eyes now, know that the reflection they could not hold is the very thing that makes you luminous. Ariadne kept her mirror, and so can you. Let your breath deepen. Let the myths fall away, and let what remains be true. There comes a moment in every myth where the story turns inward, where the clashing of swords and roaring of beasts give way to a quieter sound. the breath of decision. For Ariadne, that moment came not in a temple, not in a grand gesture of divine revelation, but in a hush, in a moonlit corridor lined with painted serpents and open windows, where the night slipped in through the stone like water into cracks. The world around her still moved. Guards patrolled, torches flickered, and the sea beyond the cliffs whispered its eternal longing. But inside her, something had gone utterly still. It is said that when Ariadne gave the thread to Theseus, she made a deal with the gods, that she broke sacred laws by revealing the labyrinth's path, that she defied Minos, her father, and with him, the entire world he ruled. But what if that isn't the truth? What if there is no god involved? What if the deal she made was not with Olympus, nor with fate, but with herself? Because sometimes the greatest rebellion is not against kings or deities, but against silence. All her life, Ariadne had been trained to be quiet, to be beautiful, composed, obedient, to smile as the bulls were sacrificed, to bow her head as her mother withdrew further into the dark. She was praised for her grace, admired for her lineage, but never was she asked what she believed. So when Theseus came, a man brimming with raw want and the illusion of purpose, he cracked something open, not because he was special, but because he offered her a doorway, not into love, into escape. And in that doorway, she stood alone. She could have refused. She could have let him wander into the labyrinth and die, as so many had before. But she didn't. Not because she believed in his heroism, but because she believed in hers. The deal she made was this: I will not remain in this cage. I will not inherit the stillness of my mother, nor the cruelty of my father. I will not live in a palace that calls itself sacred while feeding children to a myth. She didn't need a god to bless that vow. She only needed a thread, and she wove it that night, not from gold, but from memory. Every knot was a moment. Her mother's silence at supper, the look on a young girl's face as she was taken into the labyrinth, the tremor in her brother's breath behind the wall. The thread was a story, her story, and when she gave it to Theseus, she was handing over not just a lifeline, but a symbol of her own unbinding. They would leave Crete. She would become more than daughter, more than priestess, more than footnote. She didn't know what lay beyond the island, but she knew what lay behind, and that was enough. But here's where the myth grows heavier, because the stories we inherit don't like women who choose. They like women who are chosen, saved, betrayed, forgotten. And so the bard said she made a pact with Dionysus, that the god of wine and madness demanded her as his prize, that the gods took her from Theseus as punishment for her disobedience. But perhaps, just perhaps, that was how the world made sense of a woman who freed herself. The gods didn't come to claim her. She walked away on her own, in the depth of night, as the palace slept. Ariadne lit no torch. She carried no baggage, only the memory of the thread, and the silence she would never return to. That was her deal, to trade obedience for risk, to leave the known for the vast, to become something not written for her, but by her. And tonight, in the softness of your own stillness, you may find a reflection of her moment, that quiet pause before change, that trembling hush before release. You do not need the gods to approve your leaving. You do not need thunder or lightning to bless your becoming. You only need your thread, your breath, your choice. Close your eyes now. Feel the night wrap gently around you. And remember, sometimes the most sacred act is walking away. The night they fled, the sea held its breath. It was not the silence of calm, nor the peace of rest, but the hush before unraveling, as if the wind, the waves, the very gods above had leaned in to watch the thread stretch past the edge of destiny. Ariadne stood on the marble steps that spilled into the harbor, her pulse steady but strange, like a drum heard through water. She wore no crown, only a simple robe, dyed with the deep blue of crushed indigo and midnight. In her hands, the remnants of the thread still clung to her fingers, golden, soft, glinting beneath the stars like the last note of a forgotten song. Theseus waited beside the ship, pacing, impatient, focused not on her, but on the horizon. Always the horizon. The boat rocked gently in the tide, a creaking creature of wood and breath. Its sail curled tight like a sleeping bird. The others, those who had survived the labyrinth, those faceless tributes who had walked in with dread and walked out with awe, sat huddled in silence. They owed her their lives, but none of them spoke. Ariadne felt their eyes on her, not with gratitude, but with caution. What kind of woman gives away the secrets of her own blood? What kind of daughter opens the gates and tears down the mask of her kingdom? They cannot name it, but they feared it. She stepped onto the boat. The wood groaned beneath her, as if uncertain whether to carry her or resist. And in that moment, between land and sea, between palace and exile, between past and possibility, she exhaled, not from relief, from release. Behind her, Knossos shimmered beneath the moon, its white walls and crimson columns glowing faintly like bones beneath skin. A place of ritual, of power, of silence. A place she would never return to. The sails unfurled, and the wind finally, hesitantly moved. Not fast, not triumphant, but slow, like the beginning of a long forgetting. The ship slipped into the dark, and the journey began. Some would later say she ran away with her lover, that she was young, naive, romantic, that she followed Theseus out of infatuation and rebellion. But those who know, those who listen for the quiet places between myth and memory, know this. Ariadne did not escape with Theseus. She escaped from everything else, from the weight of a name that never fit, from the gaze of a father who used fear as a mirror, from a palace that asked for blood and called it balance. On that night, as the ship moved farther from shore, she did not lean into Theseus' shoulder. She leaned into the wind, and the wind, for the first time, answered. It carried the scent of islands unnamed, of salt and cedar, of something wild and unpromised. It filled the sail and hummed along the ropes, like a lullaby older than language. Theseus spoke little. When he did, his words were sharp, practical. By dawn we'll pass Delos. We must ration water. Keep low. The moonlight carries. He looked forward, always forward. Never once did he ask her what she had lost. Never once did he ask her what she hoped to find. But Ariadne, she didn't need his questions. She had her own, and they bloomed in her chest like stars. Who would she be now that she had no one to serve? What kind of woman becomes herself without permission? Would the gods follow her or forget her? The waves lapped softly against the hull. Time slowed. Her breath deepened, and sleep, like a velvet tide, began to gather at the edges of her mind. She curled beneath the sailcloth, not beside Theseus, but apart, watching the stars through a gap in the canvas. They moved slowly, elegantly, as if stitching a new tapestry across the sky. And in her hand, she still held the end of the thread, not because she needed it to guide her, but because it reminded her where she'd come from. Tonight, as you drift into your own night sea, know this. Every escape begins with one quiet moment of courage. Not loud, not bright, but steady. And every step away from the familiar is also a step toward the sacred unknown. Let the wind move through you now. Let the sails of your soul unfurl. The escape is not an ending. It is a beginning. Ships are storytellers. They carry not only bodies, but secrets. They hold every whispered promise ever made under a salt-slick moon, every lie spoken in the hush between waves. And Ariadne was beginning to hear them. It was not the creak of the mast or the hush of oars in water that caught her attention, but something deeper, a silence. Not peaceful, but heavy. Not quiet, but calculating. It began the second night after they left Crete. The sky was a blanket of crushed velvet, stitched with stars, and the sea below, it was vast and still, like a breath held too long. Ariadne lay beside the mast, watching the constellations above, tracing their slow movement with her thoughts. Theseus stood at the stern, alone, as always. She had begun to notice it then, how he drifted farther with every hour. Not physically, he was never far from reach, but emotionally, he was vanishing. The man who had clutched the thread with desperation in the labyrinth, who had knelt before her with trembling gratitude, was now silent, distant, unreadable. She had thought they were together, that they were escaping together, but now she understood. They were not sailing toward the same destination. Theseus had already arrived. His eyes, when they scanned the horizon, no longer carried wonder. They carried calculation. Ariadne began to feel it in the way he spoke to the crew. Firm, cold, as though their ordeal had hardened him, as though the labyrinth hadn't freed him, but reshaped him. One night, she approached him quietly. Her voice was soft, her question simple. "What will we do when we reach Athens?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the dark sea, as if the answer were written in the tide. Then he said, without turning to her, "There will be ceremonies, honors. The city will rejoice. Not we, not us, just the city, just him." Ariadne's heart, already battered by the unraveling of everything she'd known, tensed beneath his words like a sail caught in a storm. And it was then she knew this ship was lying, not with words, but with the story it carried. It pretended to be a vessel of salvation, of love, a beginning. But in truth, it was the final chamber of the labyrinth, a corridor disguised as escape. And Ariadne, once again, had followed the thread into a place that sought to forget her. The sea, it seemed, was just another kind of prison, one that shimmered with freedom, but sank its truths in the deep. There is a particular ache that comes with realizing the person you trusted, the one you risked everything for, never truly saw you, not as equal, not as savior, not even as companion. To Theseus, she had been the key, a means to an end, and now that the door was open, he no longer needed to hold her hand. She began to sleep less. She watched the stars longer, and one night, beneath the rising moon, she let the thread slip through her fingers into the sea. It floated there for a moment, gold against black, and then slowly it sank. She watched it disappear, a piece of herself returning to the unknown. And for the first time, she did not feel afraid. She felt unbound, because the ship had lied, and so had he. But her soul, her silence, her knowing, had not. She sat at the bow then, alone, her feet just above the water, and she whispered not a curse, but a promise. To be forgotten is not the end. To be free is tonight, as you drift upon your own quiet waters. Perhaps you too carry a story that once felt safe, but now feels false. Let go. Let the thread sink. The truth will not drown. It will rise again, in another place, on another shore. And when it does, you will no longer be waiting. You will already be there. They say he left at dawn, that Theseus rose before the gulls had begun their crying, before the sun had crested the curve of the earth, while the sea was still clothed in indigo dreams. They say he stepped lightly onto the sand, adjusted the sail without sound, and sailed away without a word. And Ariadne slept, or perhaps she only pretended to. Some versions of the tale insist that she was abandoned in her sleep, lulled by trust into unconsciousness. Others claim she awoke to an empty shore, her heart collapsing like a lung pierced by betrayal. But there is another version, a quieter one, a version told only in hushed tones by the women who live closest to the sea. And it begins not with Theseus, but with the island. Naxos, the island that did not wait to be chosen, the island that chose her. When Ariadne stepped onto its sands, the very earth seemed to breathe in rhythm with her grief. Not in pity, no, the island had no use for such things, but in recognition, because Naxos is old, older than myth, older than names. Its stones were shaped by hands that never wrote histories. Its caves once held women who bled by the moonlight and sang to the wind. Its cliffs bore witness to rituals that the gods themselves forgot. It is not a place of glory. It is a place of becoming. And it was waiting for her. Some say the island stirred the moment her feet touched the ground. The trees bent slightly inward, as if to shield her. The breeze shifted, carrying not salt, but something softer. The scent of myrrh, of lavender, crushed beneath ancient feet. Ariadne walked until her legs gave out, past the white curve of the beach, into the hills, where goats wandered like spirits. She found a grove of cypress and fig, and there she sank to the ground, her back to the sea, her hands open, empty. There were no tears. She had already given them to the wind. Instead, she sat in silence. The kind of silence that comes after the final note of a song you didn't know you needed. The kind that lingers in the bones. The sun rose slowly, painting the rocks gold. Birds stirred overhead, but kept their distance. Ariadne did not move. She was no longer waiting to be saved. She was listening, to herself, to the island, to the strange and ancient rhythm that pulsed beneath her skin and echoed in the stones. And Naxos listened back. It did not speak in words, but in signs. A sudden wind that lifted her hair like a blessing. A distant flute-like sound that no one else seemed to hear. The hush of leaves that whispered her name, not as a daughter, or a lover, or a traitor, but simply Ariadne, the girl who had unraveled a myth and now stood threadless, named burning clean. By the second day, she had stopped looking toward the horizon. Theseus and the ship he sailed on no longer lived in her imagination. She had become the horizon. She walked barefoot through the island, feeling its breath under hers. She slept on smooth stone and dreamed of spirals, not swords. She ate from the land, figs so sweet they felt sacred, olives that tasted like memory. And in her solitude, something within her unfurled. Not quickly, not with triumph, but gently like moss growing over grief. This was not abandonment. It was initiation, because the island had not been a stop on his journey. It had been the beginning of hers. They say that Dionysus came to her on that island, that the god of wine and madness, crowned in ivy and stars, found her dancing under the moon. But maybe that's just how the world explains a woman who chooses her own ecstasy. Because what if the god did not come to claim her? What if she called him, not with words, but with presence, with the sheer audacity of becoming whole in solitude, with the kind of beauty that is not made for men to possess, but for the earth to honor? Because islands like Naxos don't belong to maps. They belong to moments, to women who have been undone and choose not to be rebuilt, but reborn. And Ariadne was becoming myth, not because someone wrote her into one, but because she stepped beyond the need for rescue and into the silence that sings. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps you too have known a ship that lied. Perhaps you, too, have been left on a shore that felt like an ending. But listen, the sand beneath you is not exile. It is invitation. The island sees you. The island chooses you. And in this sacred stillness, you may finally begin. Mist is a threshold. It hovers between what is and what might be, blurring the lines of form, blunting the edges of certainty. It does not ask questions. It simply arrives soft, enveloping, without warning. And on the 7th morning of her solitude, Ariadne saw him in the mist. But this is not the story of a god descending from the sky in blazing divinity. This is not Olympus cracking open in trumpet blare and thunder. No, Dionysus came quietly, like the truth after grief, like a stranger who feels like memory. He did not arrive in ceremony, but in rhythm, a rustle of leaves, the shuffle of bare feet on stone, the clink of bracelets, wooden, not golden, each one humming its own quiet history. Ariadne was gathering figs from a low-hanging tree when she felt him. She turned, not startled but expectant, and there he was. He wore no crown, yet ivy circled his brow. He carried no staff, yet the air bent gently around him. His hair was wild, his skin sun-kissed and scarred in places the myths never mention. But it was his eyes, that held her, not with force, but with recognition. They were eyes that had seen ruin and rapture, that knew the weight of madness and the balm of music. Eyes that did not ask, "Who are you?" but rather, "How long have you been waiting to be seen?" They say Dionysus is the god of wine, of revelry, of chaos. But that is only the surface. Beneath the intoxication lies something older, a sacred kind of unraveling. He is the god who dances where others demand, who blesses what others shame, who calls the broken not to be fixed, but to be crowned. And he saw her not as lost, not as discarded, but as becoming. They sat together under the fig tree, saying nothing at first. He poured her wine, earthy, rich, made from grapes pressed by feet on hills that sang. She drank, and the flavor unfolded like memory in her mouth, dark, strange, sweet. Later, when the sun softened into afternoon, he spoke. "You are not the thread," he said. "You are the labyrinth." Ariadne did not reply. She did not need to, because the words did not enter her like revelation. They echoed something she had already begun to feel, that she was not the one who guided heroes. She was not a side character in their ascent. She was the spiral, the mystery, the sacred center that men could only approach, but never own. Dionysus never asked her to follow. He danced in a clearing of olive trees, with dust rising around his feet. He spun and stomped and moved like water given form. And she, tired of stillness, tired of watching, joined him. She moved not as a girl, but as a force. Her arms arched like crescent moons. Her hair swung with the wind. And in that dance, something in her broke open, not into pain, but into power. They danced until the moon rose. And under its silver gaze, he kissed her, not as a possession, not as conquest, but as offering. The kind that says, "I see what you are, and I will not dim it." The myths often reduce this moment. Ariadne made wife of Dionysus, as though she were claimed like land, gifted like a vase. But in truth, it was not a wedding. It was a meeting of two souls shaped by madness and exile. Two spirits who had walked through fire without becoming ash. And that night, they did not sleep. They wandered the island in slow steps and laughter. They drank wine from clay cups and spoke of stars that were not yet named. They howled at the sky and listened for the howl returned. In Dionysus, Ariadne did not find redemption. She found reflection, a mirror that did not distort, a mirror that said, "You are already divine." And the island, wrapped in mist, wrapped them both in a silence too holy for words. So now, as you rest in your own night mist, as the veil of sleep begins to settle over your thoughts, let this be what you remember. You do not need to be chosen. You need only to be seen. And there, in the mirror of another soul, you may finally remember who you've been all along. Not the thread, not the hero, the labyrinth, the center, the story, and the dance has only just begun. Some crowns are not forged in gold or iron. Some are not bestowed in palaces or witnessed by kingdoms. They are woven in silence, in surrender, in the stillness after becoming. Ariadne's crown came not from a throne, but from the sky. They say Dionysus gave it to her. A gift, a coronation, a declaration of love. But the truth is more tender than that, and far more ancient. It began on the high cliffs of Naxos, where sea meets sky in breathless blue. Ariadne stood barefoot at the edge, wind carving wild ribbons through her hair, the taste of salt and wine still on her lips. Beside her, Dionysus watched in silence. He did not speak. He did not instruct, because some moments are too sacred to shape with words. She looked up. The sky was velvet black, infinite and awake. The stars blinked above like old eyes remembering her. And then something stirred, not in the heavens, but in her, that thread she thought she had let go in the sea. She now felt inside her again, not as a tether, but as a spiral, a soft golden pulse in her chest. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, keeper of the labyrinth, once defined by the myths of men, was no longer any of those things. She had walked through her forgetting. She had danced with a god. She had wept without shame. And now, she stood unbound, and the stars took notice. A circle of light shimmered above her, not descending from heaven, but rising as if drawn by her breath. Soft, pale, flickering. A crown, not of jewels, but of stardust and silence. A crown only the night could give. Some myths say Dionysus placed it upon her head with a flourish, that he lifted her chin and declared her his queen. But what if he didn't? What if he only watched, as the sky itself reached toward her? What if Ariadne crowned herself, not in ego, but in essence? What if the stars had always been hers, waiting for her to stop looking down? She did not need to kneel. She did not need a vow. The crown appeared the moment she remembered. She was not the one who handed the thread to the hero. She was the thread, the circle, the path, the center in the return. And the stars, oh, the stars recognized their own. They circled above her, slow and reverent, forming the shape we now call Corona Borealis, the northern crown, not a constellation of conquest, but of transformation, a reminder, etched into the night for all eternity, that sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones we shout, but the ones we live quietly, the ones we survive, the ones we outgrow. Ariadne stood beneath her crown, her hair alive with wind, her eyes steady as moonlight. Dionysus reached for her hand, not in possession, but in awe, and together they turned away from the edge. They did not return to the palace. They did not build a new one. They disappeared into the wild, into rites and laughter and the holiness of those who live outside the lines. But the sky remembers. The stars do not forget. They mark the place where she was seen, where she was not rescued, but risen. So tonight, as you settle into sleep beneath your own dark sky, remember this. Your crown does not need ceremony. Your power does not need witness. It only needs a moment, a breath, a knowing. Look up, somewhere above you. A ring of stars pulses quietly, not to be worshipped, but to remind you. You too are more than the story they told. You too are the thread, and the crown was always yours. Some marriages are not written in vows. They are whispered in the stillness between breaths. They are poured, not into parchment or priesthood, but into wine, into ritual, into myth, into memory. The union between Ariadne and Dionysus was never meant for the altar. It was meant for the soul. The world would later dress it in language it could understand. Marriage, wife, divine couple. But what happened on the sacred soil of Naxos was not a ceremony. It was an alchemy. After the stars crowned her, after the mist had lifted, after the final threads of her past dissolved into the soil beneath her feet, Ariadne began to live in rhythm. Not in structure, not in expectation, but in rhythm. Dionysus did not bring order. He brought music, and from that music they built a world. It began with wine, not the kind found in modern glasses or labeled by region, but wine made in the ancient way, by feet pressed into grape flesh, by time, by moonlight. The first cup they drank together was not part of a feast. It was part of a silence, the kind that follows along grief. They sat beneath a fig tree, its branches heavy with fruit, and drank not to forget, but to remember more softly. The wine tasted like wildness, like sun-warmed stones and wind across the skin, like stories told by bodies instead of mouths. Ariadne felt it bloom in her chest, a heat that was not fire, but recognition. Dionysus watched her, not with desire, but with reverence, and in that gaze, the world bent. They say he took her as his queen, that he declared her divine, but the truth is gentler. He asked for nothing. She offered everything, not out of surrender, but out of sovereignty. Their union was not forged in possession. It was formed in presence. Together, they walked the island barefoot, through olive groves and stone circles long buried by time. They laughed like children, wept like prophets, danced until the stars spun in response. And always, there was wine, not as intoxication, but as communion, a sacred liquid passed between hands, between lips, between hearts, a slow, earthy hymn in a cup. Each sip was a remembrance of what had been lost, of what had been found, of what had never been named. Their love did not follow the shape of the world. It spilled beyond it, like the wine that overflowed the cup. The people of Naxos, those few who lived tucked among the hills, began to speak of the woman in white and the god who sang. They left offerings near the cliffs, bowls of honey, garlands of ivy, and clay vessels filled with wine too sweet for commerce. And Ariadne, once forgotten on the shore, once called traitor and abandoned bride, became legend, not because she asked to be, but because she had become something the world didn't know how to forget. A goddess, not in the way Olympus defined, not thunder, not decree, but in stillness, in presence, in the wild holiness of someone who has survived herself. The rites of Dionysus, the bacchanalia, the secret dances, the vine-crowned women who fled into forests and returned changed. They would carry her name for centuries. Not always spoken, but always felt, because her marriage was never meant to be remembered by a date. It was meant to echo, in every sip of wine taken in mourning or celebration, in every moment of release after pain, in every quiet dance beneath the trees. Ariadne became the pause between grief and joy. She became the space where healing hums. And Dionysus, mad god, gentle god, god of those who do not fit, never claimed her. He simply stayed. So tonight, if you hold a cup, if you raise it to your lips, let be more than habit. Let be memory, not of sorrow, but of the day you were crowned not by hands, but by sky, and loved not for your beauty, but for your becoming. Drink slowly, and remember, the most sacred marriages are not made in front of witnesses. They are made in front of yourself, and in that reflection, you are never alone. She was no longer clothed in silk. no longer adorned with polished metal or confined by the weight of palace dignity. No longer the obedient daughter of Minos. No longer the girl who once watched the sea in tears. Ariadne, crowned by stars, anointed by wine, kissed not by destiny but by wilderness, had stepped beyond the edge of myth and into something far older. She had become untamed, a goddess among feral things. The rites of Dionysus were not ceremonies in the way we understand them. There were no temples, no prayers etched in marble, no altars built by trembling hands. There were only circles of dancers, of trees, of time. The women who followed him, the Maenads, as they came to be called, did not bow. They ran, they climbed, they screamed, and they healed. These were not the tame priestesses of ivory cities. These were women who had burned down their pasts and fed the ashes to the moon. They wore ivy crowns instead of veils. They wrapped their bodies in animal skins and barefoot wisdom. And when they looked at Ariadne, they did not kneel. They danced, because they saw in her not a goddess made by decree, but one born from rupture, from abandonment, from a thread once thought lost, and now returned in blood and bloom. She led them not with instruction, but with presence. She did not command. She moved. Her arms wove stories through the air. Her feet struck rhythms the earth remembered. Her voice, when she sang, was not melodic. It was elemental, and in her orbit, the forest awoke. Deer wandered near without fear. Snakes slithered across her feet without threat. Even the wind shifted course, dancing through the trees with a wild sort of reverence. The wild things did not worship her. They recognized her, because they too had been misunderstood. They too had been named monstrous by those who feared what could not be controlled. And Ariadne, now stripped of expectation, now clothed only in dusk and divinity, was kin to them. She spent her days beneath fig trees and her nights in sacred trance. No longer bound by the language of kings, she spoke in silence and rhythm. They say the stars moved when she danced, that the sea rose higher to reach her, that the vines grew faster, intoxicated by her footsteps. But she was not dangerous. She was free. And in a world built on control, on ownership, on names and lines drawn in stone, freedom is the wildest, most radical form of divinity. Some nights, Dionysus would appear with his followers, emerging from the mist like a fever dream. They would dance through the hills until dawn, singing to no one and everything, drinking wine that tasted like fire and memory. And when Ariadne joined them, the very land seemed to pulse, as if it remembered her sorrow and celebrated her transformation. She was no longer a woman seeking a place. She was the place, the forest, the rhythm, the spiral. No longer Ariadne of Crete. Now, Ariadne of the wild. Not savage, as the poets later painted her. Not frenzied, but primal, sacred. A holy creature who had remembered her original shape. And so, the stories changed. Not in the scrolls, but in the soil. In the way grapes grew heavier where she walked. In the way women who had lost everything came to dance and left crowned with laughter. In the way animals lay at her feet as if returning home. She had become a goddess not of war, not of wisdom, not of the hearth, but of return, of the spiral that begins a heartbreak and ends in freedom. So tonight, as your breath softens and your thoughts quiet, ask yourself, what part of you has been called too wild, too much, too strange to be sacred? That part is your crown. And in your dreams, if you walk through a forest lit by starlight and smell figs on the breeze, know this, you are nearing her. Ariadne waits not to be worshipped, but to dance. And you too are welcome in the circle. He returned to Athens not in triumph, but in shadow, though the songs would later claim victory. That Theseus had slain the beast, escaped the labyrinth, and sailed across the wine-dark sea as a hero crowned by fate. The truth, as it so often does, whispered something quieter beneath the verse. Theseus had forgotten the thread, not the golden one Ariadne placed in his hand. That thread had served its purpose. But the other thread, the invisible one, the one that binds soul to soul, the one that, once broken, leaves a silence that echoes louder than any glory. The tale tells us that he left her sleeping on the shores of Naxos, that he sailed away in haste, heart heavy or heart empty, depending on the version. But what is rarely told is what followed. Not for her, but for him. Because what does a man become when he severs the only thing in his journey that was sacred? He becomes legend, but only because the truth is too brittle to bear. As the sails caught wind and the island disappeared behind him, Theseus turned his gaze forward. Always forward. That was his way. He did not look back at the woman who gave him more than a path through the labyrinth. He did not look back at the part of himself that had knelt at her feet in the darkness. He did not look back at the tenderness that had made him more than a prince, that had almost made him human. He looked forward toward Athens, toward the city he hoped would forget his father's sins, toward the people he believed would finally see him. And as the ship approached the horizon, he forgot, not by accident, by choice. The black sails still hung from a mast. It was a custom, simple and sacred. Should Theseus return alive, the sails must be white, to signal victory, to spare his father the torment of uncertainty. But Theseus, lost in his own unraveling, did not change them. And so, when the ship came into view, black against the gold of the sea, King Aegeus stood atop the cliffs, watching. And then he leapt, fell into the sea that now bears his name, not as punishment, but as prophecy, because even kings know the weight of forgotten threads. The city welcomed Theseus with songs and garlands, with cheers that echoed through marble streets. But in his chest, something had shifted. He smiled, yes. He raised his hands in victory. But at night, when the celebrations grew still, when the wine turned bitter and the firelight flickered across the empty corners of the palace, he remembered. He remembered the cave of the Minotaur and the trembling of his own hands. He remembered the softness of a voice that had guided him without needing to be heard. He remembered Ariadne, and he did not speak her name, because to speak it was to admit that the thread had not led him home. It had led him to himself, and he had abandoned both. Over time, Theseus grew heavier with myth. He founded cities, led wars, stood among kings and gods. But something in him remained frayed, unfinished, because no hero survives without his thread, and Theseus had severed his. In the old versions of the myth, he is remembered with pride, but in the whispers of the wind, in the sighs of the sea, in the dreams of those who have loved and lost without answers, he is remembered with sorrow, because the greatest tragedy is not in betrayal. It is in forgetting the hands that held you when you were still becoming. Ariadne never cursed him. She never needed to. He would carry the echo of her absence longer than any spell. And so tonight, as you lie in the hush between your own memories, perhaps you, too, have known a thread once held and then lost. Perhaps you, too, have stood at the edge of ship's deck, wondering what it is you forgot to remember. Let this be your reminder. You were the thread, and what you gave was not forgotten by the stars, only by those too afraid to be seen. Sleep now. You are not forgotten. You are the thread, and the story still holds. He had waited every morning. King Aegeus, the weary ruler of Athens, The man whose name would come to shape the sea itself, stood atop the cliff each dawn, scanning the horizon, eyes narrowed, hands clasped behind his back, heart caught in a rhythm not his own. He had sent his son away with nothing but hope, and the sea had swallowed him whole. And now, like a father holding his breath for days that stretch into seasons, Aegeus watched from that jagged rock that jutted like a promise into the air. He searched for a sail, white, pure, victorious. That was the deal. White sails meant life. Black sails meant death. It was a ritual, a symbol. And symbols matter most to those who know how fragile the truth can be. Each day, the wind played its cruel trick. On the third morning, a glimmer in the far distance. On the fifth, a trick of cloud shaped like a mast. On the sixth, nothing but fog. But on the seventh day, he saw it, a ship cutting through the water like a memory returning. Closer, closer still, and above it, like a wound stitched into the sky. Black sails, no change, no signal, just the color of morning. Aegeus did not cry out. He did not weep or scream or rage. He simply stepped forward into the open air and let gravity complete what grief had already begun. Some say he leapt without hesitation, as though propelled by the weight of love. Others say he stood for a long moment on the edge, torn not by doubt, but by the unbearable quiet that comes when hope leaves the body. Whatever the truth, the sea took him, and in doing so became something else. The Aegean, a name born of loss, a body of water named not for power, but for sorrow, for a father who died not in war, but in waiting. And what of Theseus? The prince-turned-hero returned to a city that greeted him with celebration, its people blissfully unaware of the echoing void just beyond the marble steps. He had forgotten the sails. That's how the myth tells it, that in the flurry of return, the memory of the black fabric escaped him. But forgetting is not always innocent. Sometimes forgetting is a kind of armor, because to remember the sails was to remember the girl, the labyrinth, the thread, the face of a brother beast in the dark. And so, by leaving the sails unchanged, Theseus rewrote the ending. He allowed the world to see him only as survivor, not as son, not as betrayer, not as boy still trembling from the thread that led him through his own fear. But the sea remembers. The sea holds everything. The Aegean is not just a map line or a tourist dream. It is a memory that pulses under the boats, under the fish, under the surface. It remembers the cry of a father falling, the silence of a ship returning, the name that became water. And in that sea, there are whispers still of the way grief shapes legacy, of the way a single forgotten sail can shift the course of myth. Because in the end, it wasn't the beast that broke the kingdom. It was the forgetting, the thread unraveled not in the labyrinth, but in the space between intention and awareness. Aegeus died because of silence, and silence is the heaviest stone a story can carry. So now, as you lie beneath your own dark sky, as the waves of thought begin to slow, listen. What sail have you left, Black? What signal have you forgotten to raise? Do not judge yourself. You are not the only one who has looked away. But now, you can remember, not to rewrite the past, but to reclaim the thread. The sea holds grief, but also holds rebirth. Let your breath rise and fall like tide. Let your body rest upon the shore of this moment. And know this, even black sails can lead to light. Centuries passed. The stories turned brittle. Scrolls faded. Frescoes flaked into dust. The names of kings were buried beneath the weight of empire, and the whispers of goddesses drifted into silence. But still, beneath the skin of the earth, something pulsed. Something waited. It wasn't until the late 19th century that a man arrived, dust in his pockets, dreams in his eyes, carrying not a sword, but a trowel. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, an English archaeologist, a scholar, a seeker, a man haunted not by war, but by myth. He came to Crete chasing a rumor, fragments of pottery, hints of a forgotten civilization that spoke not in Latin nor in Greek, but in spirals, bulls, and sea-born dreams. He did not know her name then. Ariadne was still folded between lines of poetry and temple ash, still tangled in the golden thread of memory. But something in the soil called to him, and so he began to dig. The earth opened slowly, stubbornly, like an old woman reluctant to share her secrets. First stone, then corridors, then frescoes, reds and blues more vivid than time should allow, then stairways that led nowhere and everywhere. And finally, Knossos, a palace, a puzzle, a place that seemed to bend history into myth and back again. Evans walked the same stones Ariadne once touched. He traced the outline of the labyrinth not with fear, but with reverence. To him, this wasn't just architecture. It was echo. He found images of women, regal, bare-breasted, adorned in serpents. He called them priestesses. Others would later call them goddesses. He saw in them not fragility, but command. Not background figures, but the center of a forgotten world. He imagined Ariadne among them. Not a girl abandoned on a beach, but a woman of knowledge, of power. He discovered tablets written in linear, a script no one could yet decipher. And he wondered, was her name there, pressed into clay, waiting to be spoken again? Evans began to reconstruct Knossos, rebuilding walls, repainting frescoes, placing pieces where he believed they had once belonged. Critics would later accuse him of inventing too much, of weaving dreams into stone. But perhaps that is what makes him part of this story, because Ariadne was never meant to be found whole, only followed, like a thread. Evans believed the labyrinth was real, that it was not a metaphor, but a map, not a tale for children, but a memory encoded in the very soil of the island. And maybe he was right, because when he stood in the throne room of Knossos, with its griffins and crescent moons, he said he felt the breath of something ancient, not just history, but presence, as if the stones themselves remembered, as if a girl, once forgotten, was watching. They say that one night, Evans dreamed of spiral, not drawn in ink, but in golden thread. It unraveled across the floor of the palace, winding into the dark. And in the dream, he followed it, down staircases no longer standing, through corridors lost to time, until he reached a chamber lit by a single flame. There, she stood, not a ghost, not a goddess, Ariadne, alive in the memory of the stones, alive in the rhythm of myth. She said nothing, but in the dream he understood that he was not here to find her. He was here to remember her, to lift her name not from rubble, but from silence. And so he did. He named the civilization Minoan, after the king she defied, but buried in his notebooks, in his sketches and symbols. She appears again and again, the dancer, the thread giver, the center of the spiral. Ariadne, not as a footnote, as foundation. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine your fingers brushing ancient stone. Feel the dust of centuries soften beneath your touch. You too are an archaeologist, uncovering the sacred beneath the ordinary, remembering what was never lost, only waiting. The thread is still there, and it lead not just to her, but to you. The sand does not forget. It slips between fingers, yes. It swirls in the wind, buries the past beneath wave and weather. But within each grain, there is memory, A record not of names or dates, but of touch, of presence, of time. And on the island of Crete, beneath centuries of conquest and silence, the sand still held the threads. Not golden, not literal, but threads of story, fragments of presence braided into ruins. It was here that the archaeologists dug. Not just Evans, but others who came after, trailing behind his shadow, armed with brushes and theories, kneeling before stones that once bore feet, now long turned to dust. In the beginning, they searched for kings. They hoped to find thrones, treasures, hierarchies that made sense to the Western mind. And they found them, they found the sprawling halls of Knossos, the faded murals of dancing figures, the symbols etched into clay tablets, still whispering in a language no one could fully read. But what they did not expect to find were the women. Everywhere, in every chamber, in every fresco, they danced, they stood, they ruled. Not behind men, beside them. Not beneath gods, among them. Their hands raised in ritual. Their bodies poised not in seduction, but in power. And among them, again and again, a figure that seemed to linger just beyond clarity. A woman holding a thread. In some scenes, she is beside a bowl. In others, among spirals. Always central, always calm. The archaeologists labeled her generically at first. Priestess, female figure, decorative motif. But the sand knew better. It had held her footsteps. It had caught her breath when she walked alone beneath the moon. It had gathered in the folds of her robe as she descended the steps to the labyrinth. And now, slowly, she was returning. Not as a queen or a wife. As a presence. A memory with weight. The spiral motif appeared everywhere. Carved into pottery. Painted onto walls. Etched into jewelry. To the untrained eye, it was just decoration. But to those who listened, who felt, it was something else. A symbol of return, of cycles, of descent and emergence, of the journey inward and back again. Ariadne's path, the thread in the sand. And yet, even as her image emerged from the earth, scholars hesitated to name her. She was too elusive, too intertwined with myth. Too female to fit neatly into the structures of historical narrative. So they categorized her as legend. They wrapped her in footnotes. They cited her as influence, never origin. But the sand kept speaking. Tourists walking through the ruins of Knossos today might not know her name, but they feel her in the sudden hush that falls in the inner chambers. In the coolness that lingers near the base of the grand staircase, in the spiral paths of the tour, unconsciously retracing her story. The thread is there, woven not into gold, but into space, into shadow and light, into sand and breath. Somewhere, near the remnants of the fresco called La Parisienne, a red-lipped figure with a gaze too knowing to be ornamental. A woman once knelt, alone, tying a cord between her wrist and her heart. Ariadne, not as myth, as presence. She is not gone. She is just walking backwards through time, unraveling into being, and the sand, faithful as ever, carries her forward, grain by grain. So tonight, as your thoughts settle like dust in the corners of your mind, know this. You, too, carry threads in your hands. Stories buried beneath your skin. Memories pressed into your breath by generations who dreamed before you. Run your fingers through the invisible sand beside you. Feel the spiral. Follow it. You're not lost. You are returning. Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine a thread. Not golden, not tangible, not something you can grasp with your fingers, but something you feel. In the hush between thoughts, in the quiet ache behind your chest when memory stirs, in the part of you that knows before knowing. This is the thread in our mind, and it is Ariadne's gift to us. long before myth became marble, before scrolls and scholars and heroic epics bound in leather. There was story as soul, carried in the body, passed from one generation's breath to the next. Ariadne's thread was never meant to live in museums or dusty textbooks. It lives in our dreams, in our fears, in the spirals we walk without knowing why. Modern minds might call intuition, the subconscious, depth psychology. Carl Jung might have called her the anima, the feminine archetype buried within the masculine mind, the inner guide that leads one through the dark maze of the self. And what is the labyrinth truly, if not the mind? A twisting structure of passageways, a riddle of memory, shadow, and fear. A place where we search for something we fear to face, and yet long to understand. We're taught to be Theseus, to enter with a sword, to conquer what dwells in the center, to escape triumphant, forgetting what we were shown. But Ariadne, she whispers something different. She says, don't fight the monster. Sit with him. Don't run through the maze. Walk, and don't seek the exit. Seek the spiral, because the spiral isn't about escape. It's about return, about coming back to the self we abandoned when we learned to fear complexity. The thread in your mind does not lead outward. It leads inward. It asks you to remember the truths you buried, the names you gave up, the feelings you silenced to survive. It asks for gentleness, not glory. It does not offer fame. It offers freedom. Psychologists today speak of integration, of healing the fractured parts of the psyche, of bringing light to the shadow. But Ariadne was already doing this long before the terminology existed. In her spiral, in her thread, in her refusal to reduce complexity to heroism, she knew that the Minotaur was not the enemy. He was the wound, and wounds do not need swords. They need sight, and that is what she offered to Theseus, to the myth, to us, a thread that says, you are not broken, you are becoming. Follow the path, even if it terrifies you, especially then, in therapy, in meditation, in ritual, in solitude. We still follow the thread. We breathe into our pain. We descend into forgotten rooms of memory. We meet our own minotaurs, not with blades, but with presence. And when we come out again, if we come out again, we are not the same. We are not heroes. We are whole. And Ariadne, though no longer seen, is there. She is the voice in the quiet, the calm before the breakthrough, the image that flickers just before you wake, the dream that leaves you with tears you can't explain. She is not a character. She is a compass. So tonight, as your thoughts begin to loosen and drift, feel the thread again. It's not outside you. It's within. It is the spiral of your breath, the rhythm of your heart. You don't have to understand where it leads. You only have to trust that it does. The mind is not a maze to be conquered. It is a myth to be remembered. And Ariadne walks beside you, silent, barefoot kind. Follow her, and you will find not an ending, but yourself. How do you name a woman who refuses to remain still? A daughter, a pawn, a witch. These are the names given to women who step outside the order, who walk a path not carved for them by fathers, kings, or myths. And Ariadne, she was all of these names at once, and none. Let us walk back, gently, into the memory of how the world saw her, not through her own breath, but through the lenses history offered. To some, she was only a daughter, the child of Minos, king of Crete, royal by blood, bound by duty, raised in marble halls and sacred silence. Ariadne was trained to obey the rhythms of the court, to wear her beauty like a shield, to keep her questions soft. She was the daughter who stood between legacy and ritual, between her mother's fading fire and her father's tightening grip. But daughters who begin to see too much, who ask, what lies beneath the surface of sacrifice and power, quickly become something else. They become threats. And so others called her a pawn. To the Athenian bards, she was the girl who betrayed her own, the princess who handed over the secrets of her kingdom to a foreign prince. She was written into their songs not as a soul, but as a symbol, a tool used to elevate the hero's arc, a disposable guide, one who served her purpose and was then discarded. The mythmakers did not ask what she wanted. They only noted what she gave. But there's a third name, whispered, feared, rarely spoken in public, but always lingering in the background. Witch, because what else do you call a woman who knows the hidden ways, who moves through moonlight with intention, who understands the spiral not as confusion, but as sacred geometry? Witch, the word is often spoken with suspicion, but underneath it lies an older knowing, one that predates kings, predates myths. It is the name given to women who remember, and Ariadne remembered. She remembered her mother, Pasiphae, daughter of Helios, a woman who could charm herbs and conjure dreams. A woman later reduced to madness because her fire burned too brightly for the cage she lived in. Ariadne inherited that fire, but she learned to carry it more quietly, not as incantation, but as thread, a golden spiral of insight, handed not as power over others, but as guidance. That is what made her dangerous. She did not wield a blade. She offered a way. And those in power fear most the woman who offers the way, because she reminds others they can walk without permission. The truth is that Ariadne was not just a daughter. She was not merely a pawn, and she was never truly a witch. She was something far harder to contain. A mirror, a living spiral of possibility. She showed those around her who they were, or could be, when unbound. To Theseus, she revealed his fear. To Minos, his rigidity. To Dionysus, his reflection. And to us, she shows the cost of abandoning yourself to fit the shape others expect you to wear. Because the moment she gave the thread, she stopped being any of their names. She became her own. And when the world could no longer place her neatly in its systems, it did what it always does with women who walk the spiral. It turned her into myth. It said she was left. It said she was claimed by a god. It said she disappeared. But we know better. She didn't vanish. She expanded. She became forest, mist, rhythm, a name whispered between breaths. So tonight, as you rest, as the day begins to fall away from your skin, ask yourself, who were you before they named you? Who are you? Beneath the daughter, the pawn, the role? Let the thread pull you inward. Let the silence speak. And if you hear the word witch in the dark, smile gently. It means you've begun to remember. There is something ancient in the shape of circle. It has no beginning, no end, no edges to contain it, no sharp points to wound, only rhythm, only return. The circle is how the earth moves through the cosmos. It's how the moon draws tides. It's how we hold hands when we pray or dance or grieve. And in Crete, the circle was once everything. Before the rise of empires, before the gods were chiseled into thrones and stories flattened into lines. The people of the Aegean danced in spirals. It was not performance. It was memory. And at the center of these dances, always, was a woman. She did not lead with words. She did not demand submission. She moved, and the others moved with her. In old frescoes from Knossos, worn now by salt and time, you can still see the curves. Lines of dancers, all female. Their arms bent into graceful arcs. Their feet poised mid-step in a rhythm that seems to sway even now. This is not choreography. It is invocation. They call it the Geranos, the crane dance. Some say Theseus danced it after escaping the labyrinth. Recreating the path he had walked with Ariadne's thread, his body retracing each twist, each breathless turn. But others, those who remember what history often forgets, say the dance was older than Theseus, older than Minos, older than story itself. Ariadne would have known this dance. She would have learned it not in books, but in the body, passed down not as instruction, but as intuition. Each turn of the foot mirrored the spiral of a labyrinth, each rotation a descent into the self, a journey inward and back out again. It wasn't just movement, it was initiation. To dance the spiral was to remember that death is not the end, that sorrow is not the center, that everything comes back around. Even you. When Ariadne danced, she wasn't performing. She was returning to herself, to the sacred, to the language that lives in breath and bone. And those who danced with her, other women barefoot under stars, faces streaked with wine and ash, were not followers. They were mirrors. Together, they moved in circles so wide they seemed to dissolve into the night. Their voices rising not in words, but in rhythm, in sound that was part chant, part heartbeat. And when the dance ended, there was no applause, only stillness, a quiet so deep it became holy, because in the spiral, something had shifted. Each woman had dropped something behind, a fear, a name, a wound, and in its place, she had picked up herself. This is the power of the circle. It doesn't elevate one above the others. It pulls everyone in. It reminds us that we are not here to conquer the path. We are here to walk it, to feel it beneath our feet, to let it shape us as we move. And so the dances continued, night after night, season after season, even long after Ariadne was gone. Even now, in villages tucked high in the Cretan hills, you can find echoes of the spiral, women gathering beneath fig trees, music rising from lyres and flutes, bare feet tracing arcs in dust. They may not speak her name, but she moves in their hips. She sings in their breath. She rests in their bones. Ariadne never needed temples. She needed only rhythm, only return, and that is what the dance gives. Tonight, as you lie still, let your breath begin to spiral. Let it curve in and out like a tide. Let your thoughts move in circles, soft and slow. This is your dance, your spiral, your descent and emergence. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of sleep, a woman waits, smiling, turning gently, her arms open in rhythm. You may join her. There is always room in the circle. Every myth sleeps, not in the way we do, with closed eyes and breath slowing beneath blankets, but in the quiet spaces of the world, in ruins, in dreams, in stories forgotten but not lost. They do not die. They wait. They wait in the folds of language, in the hush between sentences, in the creases of memory that we mistake for imagination. And Ariadne's myth has always been a sleeper. There are stories that shout. They rise like towers, loud, proud, impossible to miss. Heroes with names carved in stone. Wars fought over beauty. Gods thundering across the sky. But Ariadne's myth is not one of noise. It's a tide, not a trumpet. A breath, not a blade. Her story moves beneath the surface of history, curling quietly around the edges of other myths, appearing only to those who walk slowly, who listen gently. When she is spoken of, it's often briefly. A helper, a daughter, a girl betrayed. But this is not how myths truly work. A myth is not measured by its visibility, but by its resonance. And Ariadne's myth resonates in places where we do not expect her. In the woman who leaves the city and never looks back. In the dreamer who builds her own path instead of following a straight line. In the quiet voice inside us that says, there must be more than this. And still she sleeps. not as a ghost, but as potential. The spiral of her story rests in our bones. And like all sleeping myths, it stirs when we need it, not to offer answers, but to offer a rhythm. You see, myths never truly teach through facts. They teach through reminders. They remind us how to fall, how to lose, how to rise again. They whisper that endings are beginnings wrapped in unfamiliar cloth. That betrayal, though bitter, often cracks open the seed of becoming. That love, when stripped of possession, becomes sacred. And sleep, sweet, holy sleep, is where myths do their deepest work. Because sleep is not absence. It is surrender. It is the spiral of the self turning inward, the descent into the inner labyrinth, where old threads dangle quietly, waiting to be taken up again. When you dream of staircases that twist, of paths that vanish and reappear, of familiar faces in unfamiliar places, you are walking in the myth's sleep. When you wake with a feeling you cannot name, when something ancient stirs beneath your ribs, that is the thread brushing against you. And Ariadne, she walks softly there. She doesn't guide you with commands. She walks beside you, barefoot, silent, holding the end of the thread, just loosely enough that you must choose to grasp it, because she is not a rescuer. She is a revealer. And what she reveals, if you are willing, is that you are never lost, only wandering. Tonight, as sleep reaches for you, let it take you. Let go of the names, the tasks, the edges. Sink into the spiral. Feel the thread wind softly around your wrist. Not to bind, but to remind that the myth is still breathing, that you're still becoming, and that the deepest truths do not shout. They sleep, just like this, just like you will now. Everything ancient carries dust, not the kind that clings to the corners of neglected rooms, but the kind that breathes with memory, the kind that settles not from decay, but from reverence. When you walk through ruins, the silent halls of Gnosis, the stone thresholds of forgotten temples, you may think what you breathe is air, but it's dust, dust that once touched her skin, dust that once rose from the spiral of her dance, dust that once cloaked a labyrinth where a thread shimmered between life and shadow. This dust is not absence. It is presence, softened by time. It is the myth's blood, turned to ash, then to echo. It gathers in creases of stone, in the hollows of broken statues, in the faded lines of frescoes once brilliant with ochre and indigo. And within it, layers, not just of Ariadne's story, but of all the women who carried the weight of remembering. Their names may be gone, their voices buried, but the dust remembers. Every time a foot steps across ancient marble, every time a breath is drawn in an archaeological trench, every time someone whispers her name in the dark, the dust stirs because it knows. It knows that the myth was never just a tale of labyrinths and beasts. It was a body made of earth and breath, thread and silence, song and betrayal. Ariadne's myth pulses with the same dust that shaped us all. The cosmic residue of stars turned to skin. And when we touch history, truly touch it, we are not reaching back. We are reaching in. We are pulling the past forward, wearing it in our lungs, inviting it to live again through us. So much of her story has been reduced to tropes, to plot points, to footnotes in the margins of heroic epics. But in the dust, she is still whole. She is the footfall in the sacred grove, the spiral carved into ceramic vessels, the scent of crushed myrtle under a new moon. She is the weight of ritual. The hush before a name is spoken aloud. The vibration in your chest when you stand in the doorway of something holy and forgotten. And dust, humble, overlooked dust, carries all of it. There is a tenderness in dust that defies power. It settles where nothing else dares. It cloaks both ruin and altar the same way. It softens what time has broken, and so it has become her shrine, not in the temples, in the remains. The dust is where she lives now, not diminished, but distilled. And when you kneel in the sand of an old site, when you wipe dust from a piece of forgotten pottery, when your hands touch stone that someone else once touched with prayer, Ariadne's breath is in that dust. Her sorrow, her wisdom, her wild, woven strength. Tonight, as your own body grows heavier, as the day falls away in soft layers, imagine the dust settling gently upon your skin. Feel it not as dirt, but as memory. Let it coat your thoughts. Let it soften your wounds. Let it whisper the stories you didn't know you carried. Because you do, and because the myth still pulses. Not in books, in dust, in the sacred hush of your sleep. Not every story ends. Some simply fade. They do not close with a final line or a righteous moral. They drift like smoke rising from the last ember, or a voice humming long after the words are forgotten. Ariadne's story is one such myth. It resists the ending. It resists the pen. And perhaps that is its quiet rebellion, because the world has long been obsessed with endings. They give structure, give comfort. They let us walk away with the illusion of completion. But Ariadne was never a tale to be tied in a bow. She is the unraveling, the breath between chapters, the sacred refusal to be concluded. Ask yourself, how does her story truly end? Is it the wedding to Dionysus, eternal and divine, their love sealed in constellations? Is it the birth of children, of a new dynasty that passes gently into the fog of time? Is it her vanishing from the myths altogether, her name reduced to a crown of stars and a footnote? Or is it something else entirely? What if her ending was not an ending at all, but an opening? What if the myth doesn't conclude in her marriage, but in her metamorphosis? Ariadne, once the weaver of the thread, becomes the thread itself, woven into other stories, other women, other moments. You see, there is power in a story that refuses to die, in a woman whose myth dissolves before it can be contained, because endings make myths easier to own, and Ariadne was never meant to be owned. The versions of her story written by men, sculpted by poets, and captured in marble, those are attempts at closure, at taming. But the unwritten ending lives elsewhere. It lives in every woman who walks away from what no longer sees her, in every soul who rebuilds after betrayal, in every quiet act of self-recovery that never makes it into books. The ending of Ariadne's myth is not a moment. It's a movement, a soft, spiraling release from the need to be defined. She is the goddess of the in-between now, of the breath before the new beginning, of the sacred pause. And in that pause, in that space where no one quite knows what happened next, she is more alive than ever. Because stories do not have to finish to be true. They only have to echo. And Ariadne echoes in the way women cross oceans without maps, in the way survivors remake themselves not once, but many times, in the way healing doesn't always arrive in triumph, but in stillness. Her thread was never meant to guide others out of the labyrinth alone. It was also meant to remind her of the way back to herself. And so now, the ending is yours. Not because it's unwritten, but because you're the one holding the thread. Perhaps that's why her myth fades where others blaze. Because she stepped out of the story and into the soul. And there she waits. Not for rescue, not for reverence, but for rhythm, for you. So tonight, as you lie beneath the weightless hush of stars, as your mind begins to drift beyond form and into feeling, remember, a story does not have to end to complete its purpose. It only has to live in you. And this one does. Ariadne's myth is not finished. It is only beginning again, with your breath, right now. The sea forgets. The wind carries stories away. Even stone, with all its silence, eventually cracks. But the moon remembers everything. Long after the temples fell, long after the songs of Ariadne faded into the mouths of strangers, long after names changed and gods were renamed or abandoned, the moon still rose, and she still watched. They say the moon was once a goddess herself. Selene, riding her silver chariot across the night sky. Others say it is Artemis, protector of wild women and sacred spaces. But some, in the quiet corners of older lands, say the moon belongs to Ariadne, not because she claimed it, because it never left her. The myth tells us she was once human, a daughter, a weaver, a girl who gave her heart to a boy with a sword, and then a woman who lost everything and chose to become something else. What most don't know is that Ariadne's story does not just live in the dust and the stone. It lives in the phases of the moon, waxing, full, waning, dark, each one chapter, each one a rhythm she once danced to. In her rites on Naxos, it was said that Ariadne watched the sky with eyes unblinking, that she marked the lunar calendar with fingers stained in pomegranate juice and crushed herbs, that her own body moved with the moon's moods. When she bled, it was under a crescent. When she loved, it was beneath a full face. And when she grieved, the moon disappeared, a mirror to her silence. The moon, after all, is a spiral in the sky, always returning, always vanishing, always becoming. Just like her, there's an old tale, one not told in temples, but passed between women under olive trees late at night. That says Ariadne never truly died, that when her body faded from the world, her spirit rose and settled in the moon, not to rule, but to remember, to watch. And so, each time you stand alone in the dark, feeling the soft gravity of the night pressing gently on your shoulders, look up. You'll find her there, not as a face, but as a pulse, as a knowing. She sees you. She sees the thread you carry, the one you thought no one else noticed, the one that ties your fear to your longing, your loss to your becoming. She sees the labyrinth you've been walking in silence, the turns, the dead ends, the moments of stillness when you felt no one would ever come. And she doesn't pity you. She recognizes you, because she walked it too. The moon was not always hers, but it became hers when she chose to walk into the unknown and never look back. Now, it is her lantern, her rhythm, her message written in light. You may not hear her voice, but the moon is her breath. It tells you, keep walking, keep turning. Even when the path vanishes, the spiral remains. And when you sleep, the moon keeps watch, not to guard you, to remind you that you are never truly alone in the dark. Because somewhere, high above the world of noise and names, a thread glows quietly, and it leads not to a hero, but to a woman who once became myth, simply by choosing herself. So tonight, before you close your eyes, pull back the curtain, just a little, let her light touch your face, and know this, she watches you still, not from a place of power, but from a place of love. You are not forgotten. You're not lost. You're simply becoming, as she did, as the moon does, every single night. The shortest distance between 2 points is a line. That's what we're taught. But the truth of life, of healing, of myth, of becoming, rarely moves in straight lines. It curls, it coils, it loops back on itself again and again, until what we thought was our destination reveals itself to be a return. This is the wisdom of the spiral, and it lives inside all of us. We often think of the spiral as something external, a symbol carved into ancient stones, painted on pots, worn into dance paths and temple floors. But the spiral is more than symbol. It is anatomy. It is memory. It is truth. Look inside your own body. The curl of your inner ear, the twists of your intestines, the shape of your fingerprint, the winding architecture of your very DNA. All spirals, all maps of becoming. Nature doesn't build in straight lines. Neither does the soul, and neither did Ariadne. Her story was never linear. Not a neat arc from daughter to lover to goddess. It was a spiral. She began at the edge, a princess in a marble world that asked for silence. She moved inward, through love, through betrayal, through the breaking of everything she had known. She reached the center, the raw space of abandonment, of the threadless night. And then she turned. She began to move outward again, not to where she started, but to somewhere transformed. That is the spiral's secret. It brings us back, but changed. When you've lived a spiral, you never really go back. You return as someone who now carries the spiral within you. You become the thread. And Ariadne, though the world often remembers only the beginning or the middle of her tale, was not defined by what happened to her. She was shaped by what she chose to become after. That's why she lives in us, not as a character, as a pattern. She is in the woman who leaves a life that once seemed perfect because it no longer fits her skin. She is in the man who dares to weep after a lifetime of silence. She is in the child who draws spirals in the dirt, not knowing why, only that it feels like truth. She is in you, in a way your life has not unfolded as expected, in the detours that made no sense until they led you to the place where you could finally breathe. And she speaks, not in prophecy, but in rhythm. She reminds you that setbacks are not failures. They are turns. That grief is not the end. It's the dark center of the spiral, the place you go before you rise. That healing does not happen in a straight ascent. It wins. It doubles back. It deepens. This is the spiral that lives in us. It's why you return to certain places in your dreams. Why the same themes appear in your life again, but in new forms. Why you feel like you're starting over, when really you're spiraling upward, not repeating, evolving. Ariadne teaches us to trust this shape, to walk the path even when it twists, to pause in the center when all seems lost, to recognize the thread when it brushes our fingers again. And when we do, we stop fearing the spiral. We begin to follow it. We begin to remember it. So tonight, as you lie still in the hush of your own turning, know that this moment, even this, is part of the spiral. You're not off track. You are in motion. You are becoming. And somewhere, deep in your chest, the golden thread pulses softly, not to pull you out, but to guide you in, not to escape the maze, but to make peace with its beauty. Because the labyrinth isn't a trap, is your story, and the spiral, it is your soul, winding its way home. And so, here we are, at the end, or perhaps just one more turning of the spiral, because in truth, there is no final thread, only the one we choose to follow next. Ariadne does not end in a shrine, not in a grave, not even in the stars, though her crown still hangs above us, a delicate arc of starlight named Corona Borealis, breathing quietly in the deep folds of the night. No, Ariadne lives in the dreaming world, not as a shadow of history, but as its pulse. She is not just the girl who gave the thread, not just the woman left behind, not just the goddess who danced through moonlight with a wild god at her side. She is what remains when everything else has fallen away. And the dreaming world is where she walks most freely. You've met her before, though you may not have known her name. She is the voice that urges you down a path no one else can see. She is the sudden stillness in the middle of chaos. the breath that returns you to your body, the dream that leaves you weeping with a grief you cannot name. She is the thread that finds you when you are unraveling, not to tie you back into a version you once were, but to guide you into the version you are becoming. She walks the labyrinth of the subconscious, not to trap you, but to help you feel your way through. When you enter sleep, truly sleep, when the edges of the day dissolve and you fall backward into stars, into memory, into symbol, that is where she meets you, not as a savior, as a presence. She doesn't offer directions. She offers space, a quiet place to feel, to breathe, to descend. This is the dreaming world, a place older than myth, older than thought, a place where logic lets go, and what's left is essence. In this world, the labyrinth isn't a prison. It's a womb, a place of unmaking and remaking, and Ariadne is its keeper. She walks the dark corridors not with fear, but with knowing. She follows the spiral. She teaches you to do the same. In dreams, she may come as a woman, or a figure made of light, or as nothing at all, just the feeling of something watching, softly, kindly, as you move through your own shadow. She is there when you meet old memories. She is there when you wake with tears. She is there when you forget, and when you begin to remember again. And always, in her hand, there is a thread, not golden, not physical, but real. It waits for you to reach back, not to lead you out, but to lead you in. Because the truth is, the labyrinth isn't what you move through. The labyrinth is you, and the dreaming world, the spiral, the descent, they are all parts of your remembering. Ariadne was never the end of a myth. She was its secret center. And now, as you let sleep take you fully, as the last edge of thought begins to loosen and drift, know this. The thread is still here. You're still on the path. You are not alone in the dark. She is walking with you. And when you return, you will not be the same. You will be more whole, more wild, more true. Sleep now, brave dreamer. The thread is in your hand, and the dreaming world awaits.